Okay, hello, it's John, and this will be my video on the TV series Scream. I've been watching all the episodes from 1 to 9, and I have a theory now, before the final episode, about who the killer or killers are. So I actually have two people that I think will be killers, so the first person I think is guilty that's one of the killers is Noah. I know he's like a fan favorite, but he does look really guilty if you actually look what he says and what he does. So the first thing about Noah is that he's obsessed with serial killers, alright? Like, he says that when he was younger, he wrote a book report about Brandon James. He did research on Brandon James. And he even went so far as to contact Troy, Brandon James's brother, on more than one occasion. Although he said it led to nothing, but we don't really know what they talked about. So actually, another thing about his obsession with serial killers is that in episode 2, he specifically points out in class that Brandon James is not a serial killer, he's a mass murderer. So he makes that distinction. Another thing that makes him look guilty with this obsession that he kind of has over crime and serial killers is that he often explains, why the killer is doing what he's doing. So in episode 1, he explains that the killer is hurting, people that are loved. And when they die, people that you love die, like it really hurts a lot because you care about them. He also says that everyone is fair game until only one person is left. And the killer does constantly say that, Emma will be the last one left. So we know that there will be one person left in the end. In episode 2, he explains to Audrey that he thinks the killer is lonely and wants to share. And this is after Rachel dies, and it's kind of weird at the end of the conversation. He apologizes to Audrey for what he says, although maybe he's apologizing for Rachel being killed. In episode 2, he also tells Riley that he thinks romance is usually shoehorned in to horror movies, that it's not really part of the story. He mocks The Walking Dead. He says that, it's predictable that two hicks on the show get together. But it's also kind of funny because, he and Riley are both kind of geeks, but they get together, so that, that's kind of predictable as well, right? And Riley's kind of looking for romance, but he just kind of brushes ideas of romance off at first, but then he ends up eventually changing his mind. In episode 3, he says about killers that no one, if someone wears a mask, they'll commit more than one murder. He says something like, no one commits a murder with a mask just once. Alright? So then, in the next episode, in episode 4, at the hospital, he points out that everything they find in the hospital, like the x-rays and pictures, like the different mementos from victims and things, they all look staged. Right? And then in 5, in episode 5, he suggests that Mr. Branson Audrey suggests to Noah that Mr. Branson might be being manipulated by another psychopath. But Noah kind of brushes this off, and he doesn't really believe it. He doesn't want to, kind of listen and support this theory. He's kind of skeptical. And then in episode 6, Noah and Emma get Audrey's SD card, and they watch the video where Audrey's threatening to do something to Nina, but he never really kind of like says that she could be a suspect, so he kind of lets that, overlook that point. Noah also, in episode 7, he talks with Emma about how the killer is a classical psycho and wants to play a cat and mouse game. Right? In episode 8, Noah talks with Audrey about how the classroom is the perfect cover for finding victims, and that the killer is targeting archetypes. But he also kind of reassures her that she's probably going to be safe and she'll probably survive. And that's actually, he's talking with Audrey about that. So maybe he's hinting to her that she's not going to be a target, even though she's an archetype. That's kind of like some hints, I think, where he's talking about getting into the mind of the killer. One odd thing that happens is that, like, Noah, something that makes him look guilty is that he runs off when he's about to have sex with Riley, but he doesn't really give an explanation for why that happens, or at least a good explanation. And in that same episode is where Emma's at home. She gets terrorized by a burglar, right? Like, and someone calls her, or the killer calls her on the phone and pretends to be the security company, which is something Riley could totally do, because here's another thing: Riley is very tech savvy. He's probably the most tech savvy person in that group. The killer is also very tech savvy, because the killer's, hacking into computers and watching people. The killer's doing lots of things like putting the video up during the dance, and he's able to contact Emma without being traced, and basically to cover his tracks. So some things that show just how tech savvy Noah are is that in episode 2 he tells Riley that he just finished a project that would allow him to hack into a satellite. He says he'll use the satellite to look at stars and things, but if you can hack into a satellite, you could definitely do all these other things that the killer's been doing, hacking into other people's personal computers. That should be a piece of cake. Alright. Also, in episode 4, Noah says that he's the only one at work that can reset the routers. So, tech savvy again. He points the way to the hospital in episode 4 where Brandon had his surgeries. So he's able to find people and places fairly easily. Although in episode 1 he said he wasn't able to find out who posted the video of Audrey and Rachel making out online, even though he can find all this other information. So in episode 4, he really wants the killer's laptop from that they find at the hospital. He's the one that primarily decodes the laptop, and he finds Emma and Will's sex tape on the laptop, right? And what does he do with that? Like, he's supposed to be this genius tech savvy guy. Well, he immediately sends that clip out to everyone. So now everyone's going to see, like, Emma's first time losing her virginity to Will. And you would think a tech expert wouldn't, do something so stupid. But it happens. And then later he talks to Mr. Branson about things, the Scarlet Letter, which is kind of what he basically did with a viral video to Emma. And so, in episode 5, Noah finds Branson's malware program that can be used to spy on other people, and he later lets Emma know about the malware, possibly to, like, put the seed in her mind that Mr. Branson could possibly be the killer, right? Another thing he does is that he uses an app on his phone to get Mr. Branson's fingerprints, so he can find out more about who Mr. Branson really is and maybe what he's up to. So he's put the seed of doubt about Mr. Branson in people's minds. Now he's, collecting information about Mr. Branson. So in episode 7, Noah says that the malware is almost completely gone. So he found this malware, and it's a great piece of evidence, but hey, now it's just disappeared. So they have to find, but they know Mr. Branson's a target now. So, Noah also talks about how, Rachel's video has also disappeared, later on in episode 9. So all this information that could be reviewed and find other clues if other people looked at them is now gone. Like the malware and Rachel's video are now gone. And Noah points out that, hey, someone might be covering their tracks, or someone might be, cleaning up loose ends. Of course, unfortunately, Audrey is able to get Rachel's information off the cloud, so kind of goofed up on that one. Another thing that may or may not be worth pointing out is that Noah likes games, right? And in episode 3, when he's talking to Riley about dramas, he said video games are the new drama, right? He references The Last of Us as being a great drama. It's interesting because the title of this of episode number 3 is "Wanna Play a Game." Alright? So later, the killer talks to Emma about playing a game. Emma doesn't want to play the game, so the killer says he'll find someone else to play the game with, right? And that person ends up, of course, being Riley, right? She gets killed in the end. Another thing about video games is that the shop that he works at and possibly owns, I'm not sure about that, is called Nightmare Level. Alright, and Nightmare Level on a video game is like one of the hardest difficulties in games usually. And of course, it's Nightmare Level sounds terrifying and awful, which is what the game this murderer is playing is, right? There are no extra lives or redos. Alright? So a couple other things that point to Noah being a killer is that in episode 4, Noah says he wishes that he had something to remember Riley by after she's killed, such as a lock of her hair. Well, later on in the episode, when they go to the hospital, there are mementos from all of the people that the killer's killed. So the killer's keeping, items from victims. Riley wants, Noah wants something from Riley, who is also one of the victims. The killer didn't follow Riley to the top of the police station, so maybe he didn't have a chance to get something from Riley before she died. Right? Also, in episode 4, Noah mocks Emma for wanting to go to the sheriff and get the sheriff involved in investigating the hospital, right? So he's trying to keep other investigators out of it. So maybe he wants to control the investigation, to control what they find and what they don't find, and how they find it, maybe. He pretends like he's not listening to Audrey and Emma anymore when they decide to go to the hospital without him, but he notices them leaving. He has headphones on. We don't know if the headphones are turned on or not. Maybe he's still listening to them. But they go without him, and he eventually just follows them to the hospital and, makes his comments about everything looking staged and making a point that, hey, we should get this laptop, right? So he's kind of controlling things in that way. He also, in episode 8, he makes that the spear knife thing, right? And then he loses it to the killer in kind of a awkward way, I guess. And then later he says that the spear knife's probably joined the killer's arsenal, so maybe we'll see a return of the spear knife, right? Another thing that's odd is that Noah visits Jake in the hospital, even though he's not really friends with him, and they're kind of enemies, and they're kind of, do bad things to each other. And he talks about wanting to tell Jake things. And he starts with telling Jake about that he was the one that painted Jake's truck. And Jake kind of wakes up from his coma and tries to flip him off. And then he kind of stops there, but maybe there are other things he wanted to tell Jake as well. That's kind of odd just because they're not close or friends or anything like that. In episode 8, well, okay, also with that too, I don't think he visits Emma at the hospital, even though they're probably closer friends. But moving on, like in episode 8, Noah and Audrey talk to Emma about her kind of going crazy, and Noah makes some comments that kind of unhinge Emma more. They don't really help her, and he also mentions self-preservation, right? And this is something that maybe he's messing with her mind a little bit. In episode 8, Noah also suggests that he and Audrey should dig deeper. So after he makes that suggestion, they go to Mr. Branson's room, and they quickly find the knife that is possibly a murder weapon hidden in Mr. Branson's room. But they think, well, they already kind of screwed up at the hospital and no one will believe them. They need more information before they can go on. So, like, right after they say, hey, this isn't enough, Noah gets more information on his phone about Mr. Branson, right? I don't know where exactly the information came from, but, you know, he gets information on Mr. Branson's past. It's the information they need to go to the police so that they can come and find the knife and they can kind of incriminate Mr. Branson even more. So he's trying to frame Mr. Branson, I think. And then in episode 9, at the dance, it's interesting that Noah is the MC. He's the master of ceremonies, so he's kind of in charge of everything, and he's kind of controlling the music being played, the atmosphere. You know, he's manipulating what's happened. Because he plays the song from Pulp Fiction for Emma and Kieran, who are actually dressed as Pulp Fiction characters. So I think in his mind, it's part of his game. Like, he likes to be in control, maybe. Right? And also in episode 9, when Audrey's trying to convince Emma that Kieran, you know, it could be the killer, maybe Mr. Branson's innocent, like, Noah really kind of brushes off the idea that Kieran's the killer. He says, hey, Kieran saved my life, right? He's not a bad guy. You know, he's really trying to keep the focus on Mr. Branson as being the killer. And he just kind of goes back to the party and doesn't really care about this new idea. So those are... and also, in this conversation he has with Audrey, he also points out that Noah was the one that found all the best information that led the cops to Mr. Branson being the killer. So he found all the best evidence. You know, he is the one that's setting Mr. Branson up to be the killer. So he kind of openly admits that, right? So that's kind of the best information I found, and the reason why I think Noah is one of the killers. So in the next video I make, I'll talk about who I think is his partner in crime. So I hope you enjoyed, and please leave a comment, let me know what you think.